The story of combat until 1993 was extremely primitive and hazy. You could see high-level boxing from the 80s and a Bruce Lee movie from the 70s and believe that these people were the scariest alive, that their hands and feet had to be registered as deadly weapons, and that if they so much as touched you, your heart could explode in your chest. While it's easy to judge our brothers and sisters from over 3 decades ago, the veil over martial arts and combat was very much by design. It was culturally significant across the world to restrict the flow of information around martial arts so that they would remain more effective, both in practice and in demonstration. There is a lot of history behind these ideas, but as far as cultural significance intersecting with martial arts, Japan and their professional wrestling industry is where you're going to find the greatest examples. Across the 70s and 80s, professional wrestling's relationships with martial arts became a closer and closer marriage beyond great judokas like Masahiko Kimura having bouts with Japan's pro wrestling god Rikidozan. Antonio Inoki, the nation's biggest wrestling star, had a proto-MMA bout with boxing heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali. Students of Inoki had seceded from his promotion to pursue a more realistic, martial arts-driven alternative to traditional pro wrestling, and among those who left to pursue these idealistic alternatives, the ones we fall upon are Masakazu Funaki and Minoru Suzuki. They, along with elder statesman Yoshiaki Fujiwara, would form Pro Wrestling Fujiwara Gumi, a short-lived promotion that cultivated a roster that was inspired and promoted by catch wrestling god Karl Gotch. Among the roster of Fujiwara Gumi were names that we'll become familiar with. Names like Takeya Kufuke, Ken Kilpatrick, Kazuo Takahashi, Ryushi Yanagisawa, and Maurice Smith. In December 1992, Funaki and Suzuki parted ways with Fujiwara Gumi, along with much of the roster, but not before running a match between Ken Kilpatrick and Don Nakaya Nielsen. But unlike most of their wrestling matches, which were designed to simulate legitimate combat, the bout between the two would be real. This style of wrestling match was a hit with the crowd, which led to the belief among Funaki and Suzuki that they could maybe do this full time. Professional wrestling, but make it real. This desire would flower on September 21st, 1993, with the first event held by fledgling promotion Pancrase. The name was designed to invoke the ancient Greek grappling art of pancration, which famously acts as MMA's most direct historical counterpart as it merged all of the combat arts into one mixed rules format. But the tag for the initial event would highlight the mission statement. Yes, we are hybrid wrestlers. Pancrase's rule set would not be a culture shock to fans of professional wrestling. There were no close fist punches to the face, submissions were to be released if the ropes were grabbed, but unlike their counterparts in the early 90s, Pancrase's results would be legitimately earned by their competitors. The event had 5 fights, with a mix of the Fujiwara Gumi roster and talent that was scouted by the founders. American Taekwondo specialist Vernon Tiger White, recruited by Kilpatrick, and Dutch kickboxer Bas Rutten, recruited by Funaki and Suzuki, found their spots across from the Japanese pro wrestlers in the inaugural show. It's Bas Rutten's bout against Ryushi Yanagisawa that actually gives us a glimpse at what it is the crowd would have felt watching this for the first time. Imagine, you're a pro wrestling fan in Japan in 1993. You've seen organized combat. There were always gloves or specialized limitations, like sumo. If you've seen violence, true unscripted violence, then it's likely been unorganized flailing by untrained individuals at a bar or a concert. You pay money on September 21st to go to this hybrid wrestling show, and you see Bas Rutten and Ryushi Yanagisawa, and then the bell rings. Within 45 seconds, it was clear what this was. This was the future of the world. This was real combat able to be accessed by real people without the veil of hidden techniques or specialized circumstances. It's visceral, it's breathtaking, it's human. Bas Rutten bludgeons Ryushi Yanagisawa, but checks on him afterwards. He's excited for a quick victory, so he jumps with a split. He has left an impact on everybody in attendance. And in the end, that is the goal of pro wrestling. And any skeptics who are afraid that this hybrid wrestling would ring hollow were quickly and emphatically shut down. This is it. This is the future. The show progresses with a mixture of stunning knockouts and tight submissions, but the main event is one that would be extremely important. If this is the first MMA show, then the bout between the two top former wrestlers would be to determine the first best MMA fighter in the world. While this designation seems silly on day one, it's important to document. The main event would be between Masakatsu Funaki, the catch wrestling prodigy and founder of the company, against the foreign wonder boy Ken Kilpatrick. Now, I've mentioned Kilpatrick a few times and given a tiny bit of backstory as to his accolades and why he might be here. But you might be wondering why you've never heard that name. It's fair to wonder. It's not the name that he goes by in everyday life, and it's not the name that he was going by in pro wrestling. This was done so that it was not overly distracting to the grander framing of the event, but I think that it would be best if we correct this naming blunder as soon as we can. Ken Kilpatrick was born in Georgia at a military base, but despite the edict passed down by the United States military about loyalty and never leaving a man behind, Kilpatrick's father abandoned his family when he was 5, which pushed young Ken into a great deal of anger. This would culminate at age 13, when he was kicked out of his home and survived by committing crimes and getting into fights, eventually ending up in Susanville, California, at the Bob Shamrock Boys' Home. Kilpatrick would credit Bob as the man who helped turn his life around, eventually being legally adopted by him. As the ultimate show of respect, Ken Kilpatrick would change his name from the father who abandoned him and instead honored the man who turned a wayward and lost boy into a focused athlete of a man. From that day forward, Ken Kilpatrick would be known exclusively as Ken Shamrock. Funaki and Shamrock are the pillars upon which this new combat sport is formed. Funaki, a star pupil from a catch wrestling dynasty, and Shamrock, a prodigious talent that Funaki himself helped to scout to bring him into Japan. Over time, the legacies that these men will leave will stretch far beyond themselves. They will create a dynasty all their own and etch their names in time in a way that cannot ever be fully appreciated. But that's looking into the future. For now, the two men themselves stand toe-to-toe, ready to blaze a trail that is still being walked today. The bell rings as Masakatsu Funaki and Ken Shamrock stand on opposite sides of the ring, but together in the universe. The best fought the best at Pancrase's inaugural event, and when the dust settled, it was Ken Shamrock who stood tall. All told, Pancrase's first event is not just an amazing proof of concept, but just a generally fantastic show in all facets. The booking was incredibly even, with the catch wrestling talent on the show from Fujiwara Gumi beating their opponents quickly, save for Boss Rutan blowing out Ryushi Yanagasawa. When the Fujiwara Gumi veterans fought, the bouts were much more drawn out. Company founder Minoru Suzuki had a grappling battle with Katsuomi Inagaki, and the main event saw Shamrock and Funaki battle for the top spot. The fights were exciting, separate from the spectacle though, which is also a product of very careful and considerate matchmaking to pair up opponents of similar skill. It's an attention to detail that flows through Pancrase for the rest of 1993. At their second show in October, Ken Shamrock faces Kazuo Takahashi in the main event. Takahashi had beat George Weingeroff at Pancrase 1 by quick knockout. Boss Rutan faces Takeya Kufuke, who had submitted Vernon White in just over a minute. The second event saw dominant winners fighting dominant winners, while Funaki rebounded against Ryushi Yanagasawa and Katsuomi Inagaki fought newcomer Joop van der Ven. While this wouldn't persist as tightly, their third event in November had Funaki off of a win face newcomer Cease Bezems, and Ken Shamrock fought 1-1 Takeya Kufuke. It's a consistency that is something to be admired, as it is near constant in Pancrase. Newcomers are used as cannon fodder for promotional regulars. The mid-card guys are going to fight mid-card guys or the newcomers, but if they perform well, then they will fight the top end and get the chance to break through. Through their first 3 events, it became clear that there were 4 fighters that were the pillars to build off of if Pancrase wanted to showcase their best talent. Ken Shamrock, Masakatsu Funaki, Minoru Suzuki, and Boss Rutan. Many things made these men different. 2 are native to Japan and 2 are foreign. 3 are longtime training partners, and 1 was found in a club in Holland. 3 are natural grapplers, while 1 is a born and bred striker. But what united them was that they were the best of the trailblazers in this crazy sport. But shortly after their 3rd event, a renegade force came thundering in from the west. A culture shock that would change the world in a very different way. The Ultimate Fighting Championship, later coming to be known as UFC, also sought to present legitimate open combat. But where Pancrase chose to blend it with professional wrestling and invoke ancient Greece, the UFC took a markedly different approach in its philosophy. The fights would take place inside of an octagonal cage. An executive behind its promotion wanted people to think of famously brutal fighting game Mortal Kombat. It was held in Denver, Colorado, specifically to avoid reckoning with more prominent sanctioning committees. The Ultimate Fighting Championship was designed for brutality at every step, but there was something that gave it an aura of legitimacy. While it wasn't presented this way at the time, the UFC and its backing was also part of a long martial arts dynasty. The Gracie family, an esteemed family from Brazil, were the innovators of what would come to be known as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a combat form derived from judo and adapted over the years by the family. Unlike the catch wrestling of Antonio Inoki and Karl Gotch that gave birth to Pancrase, Jiu-Jitsu was an art honed and forged in combat, with Gracie family patriarch Elio Gracie taking part in famous Vale Tudo bouts in the 30s and 40s. However, while Elio and brother Carlos Gracie were successful in their promotion of their name and the martial arts system, it would be the next generation that would shape it for much of the next century. There are all sorts of fascinating stories about the Gracie family throughout the 20th century. The saga of Valdemar Santana in the 1950s, the fracturing and rejoining of the family tree in the face of common enemies, the wars between jiu-jitsu and luta livre taking place in the ring and on the streets. But come the late 80s, early 90s, the Gracie family had begun to spread outside of Brazil. Rorion Gracie, Elio's eldest son, had gone to the United States to work in movies. And in 1988, he produced the documentary Gracie's in Action, a project telling the history of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu against other styles. After its moderate success, Rorion invited some of his brothers to California to open the first Gracie Academy, producing further VHS tapes of the modern-day Gracie challenges, with martial artists showing up to their gym to try their hand at fighting the mythical Gracies. In 1993, he would meet Art Davie, an advertising executive who was looking to hit it big, and together they conceptualized a broadcast pay-per-view version of this Gracie Challenge, a no-holds-barred tournament between fighters of different martial arts backgrounds to determine who the greatest fighter in the world would be. The UFC and Pancrase are a special contrast in how the same ideals can produce such differing results. Both combat sports promotions were born from a desire to merge traditional martial arts with modern presentation and ambitious promotion. But while Pancrase created hybrid wrestling, the UFC created blood sport. The first UFC tournament was a field of 8 men fighting down to a final winner in a single night. The rules were extremely limited. No biting, no eye gouging, no time limits. Pretty much everything else was fair game. We'll get to the field of 8 in a moment, but I want to show the first UFC fight in the tournament because it truly is one of MMA's most important bouts. The fight was between French savate practitioner Gerard Gordeau and Samoan sumo wrestler Taylor Tuli. The two weigh in at nearly 200 pounds apart. But as the bell rings, it took only one exchange for the lanky Gordeau to knock Tuli down and deliver a brutal kick to the opponent that ended the fight there and then. Once again, if we go back to 1993 and you watch this fight, then you were seeing something that was even more unheard of than had been shown in September at Pancrase. But what makes it striking to this day is how it is also as far as can be from modern MMA. Sure, Pancrase has rope escapes and no closed fist shots, but a kick to a downed opponent that brutal and a gloveless punch will never be seen in a UFC cage again. That knockout from Bas Rutten to kick off Pancrase and the knockout of Taylor Tuli by Gerard Gordeau belong in different worlds altogether. Bas Rutten could still feasibly be called a primitive version of MMA. Gordeau's belongs in a horror film. But that's what the UFC offered. They were open rules combat designed to shock, and they were more successful than they could ever imagine. More on that later. While many prominent athletes were invited, American judoka Jean Labelle, Dutch kickboxer Peter Ertz, Japanese karateka Masaki Satake, to name a few, the list of fighters participating in the UFC were not exactly the who's who of their representatives. Among the roster, we find Kevin Rozier, a journeyman kickboxer from the 80s, Art Jimerson, an average regional boxer from St. Louis, Patrick Smith, an ordinary American kickboxer who, fun fact, would go on to gain some prominence in 1994 by beating a young Andy Hoog in Japan in a fight that is so notable for accusations of being fixed that it mentions it in the small blurb about his kickboxing career on Wikipedia. Suffice it to say that this tournament field is not exactly the Battle of the Titans that it could be presented as. However, there are two exceptions to this, and it's why the bones of the first UFC event are so interesting to dig beyond besides simply its concept. First, there was the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu representative, Helio Gracie's son, Royce. Royce Gracie was the youngest of Helio's adult children, and while he'd seen his share of fighting in the Gracie Challenge Dojo tapes, he was much less proven in the ring than his older brother Rickson, who was long canonized as the Gracie's fighting champion. Still though, Royce comes armed with a secret art that nobody in this tournament is fully ready to contend with, except for maybe the other exception. Across from Gracie stands a pillar of a man. Born in America, but had made his way to Japan, where his proficiency in combat, even by November 1993, preceded itself. A man who had begun forging his own competitive supremacy before this tournament. A man who, in hindsight, could be called the best fighter in the world. Ken Shamrock, representing the Japanese art of shoot fighting, entered the bracket on the same side as Royce Gracie, meaning that the two would meet should they both win their quarterfinal bouts. Shamrock blew through Patrick Smith quickly, but Royce's fight, while it's also a quick submission, gives a glimpse into how foreign his art was. Royce Gracie fights Art Jimerson, who's only notable in this event for how he approached it. Jimerson entered the cage as the only fighter in the tournament to wear gloves. One glove, actually. Jimerson believed that if he was fighting opponents with no boxing experience, then he could simply win fights with his jab, so to protect his lead hand, he wore a single glove. It's perhaps the most striking image from this event. Jimerson in a low stance wearing one glove across from Royce Gracie, wearing a traditional gi and throwing a front kick. If the executives behind the Ultimate Fighting Championship wanted to invoke Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter, then this is the image that they dreamed about. Two people from two entirely different worlds meeting in the garb of their martial arts. When the bell rang, Royce quickly got Jimerson down, and it wasn't long before Jimerson submitted, but it wasn't because of a choke or a limb lock. Technically, it is recorded in the books today as a smother choke, and if you look up this term, you'll find videos talking about it like it's a real thing, but the language that I've seen refer to it in years past describes it as a submission via mount. Jimerson was mounted, he tried escaping, and before Royce could do anything, Jimerson tapped out. It wasn't because he was being hurt, it wasn't because he was being strangled, it was because he was afraid. He moved his hips, he pushed with his arms, he tried to roll, and he could not move. There are a lot of funny fight records throughout history. No Contest, Fans Rioted, is a favorite of mine, as is Submission Terror. Submission or TKO via exhaustion is one we'll become semi-familiar with as we go, but there are very few instances of a submission via mount that we're ever going to see. Today, it would be completely unheard of. You would get an explanation, like an injury, but that's what it was like in 1993. People were having things done to them that they would have never expected. Royce Gracie beats Jimerson and advances to meet Ken Shamrock. The winner would undoubtedly be regarded as the favorite in the finals no matter who advanced, and no doubt could be called the best fighter in the world. But as we'll discover, this fight means more than just that. For all the gravity that I can lend to it, the bout in question would likely be finished before I am. The fight lasted 57 seconds. Royce Gracie catches Shamrock in a choke that ends the fight via submission. Now, this fight is a source of a great deal of controversy alleged by Shamrock, and we'll come to find out that the word of fighters is not the most reliable thing, especially as it pertains to explanations of their losses. But before even talking about the specifics, the post-fight scene of Shamrock, clearly indignant and wanting explanations, definitely lends to his claim that he was led astray. Shamrock claims that he was told by the promotion, which, for transparency, is headed by Royce's brother Horian, that he was not allowed external accessories. which meant that he could not wear his wrestling shoes. This would answer the question of why a wrestler who had always competed on the mat and in the ring with shoes wouldn't wear them when Art Jimerson had worn shoes, and also why Ken was so bewildered when Royce not only wore a gi, but also was allowed to grab and grip it to gain superior positions. Ken Shamrock is one of MMA's most open books. As we'll learn in the coming years, he is the source of a lot of information regarding this early era of the sport, but it's also important to remember that the finer details of the pioneers all come from unreliable narrators. For example, Shamrock tells a story about how before the event, he was told about it and he scoffed and said, "That's wrestling. That isn't real, you'd get arrested." But also tells a story about how he signed up for the show and showed Funaki and Suzuki the Gracie's in Action DVD, and they were upset that he was going to participate in such a brutal show. He was so in the zone that he didn't really think about it when they told him he couldn't wear shoes, but then he didn't zero in until Gerard Gordeau kicked Taylor Tooley. It's a story that has a lot of both confirmations and holes in it. He's a complicated man, that Ken Shamrock, but for all of his conflicting and contrasting stories, the loss to Royce Gracie burns him deep. Ken felt that he had been cheated. That part of the story has never changed. Ken Shamrock will talk about UFC 1 for the next 30 years and has never once relented on how he felt that he was cheated by the Gracies taking his shoes away. But tonight, he was done. It wasn't his night. He'll have plenty of time to lick his wounds, but for Royce Gracie, he had a bout set for the finals. A bout with a man who, for a short period of time at least, was the most notorious man in the world. Royce Gracie's victory over Gerard Gordeau was necessary. For the UFC to take off like it did, it kind of needed Royce to win. When such a culturally shocking moment happens, people often find comfort in a familiar figure. After 9/11, when Americans were terrified of what was going to happen, the controversial president George W. Bush found his approval ratings across both sides of the partisan divide of US politics skyrocket. When people are confused, they will find comfort in what they understand. The UFC demonstrated to everybody who saw it that they did not understand combat, that simply learning martial arts could not protect you from being harmed. And in that revelation, it wasn't a grizzled barbarian who won the Ultimate Fighting Championship, but instead a small monk type from Brazil, wearing a traditional gi and giving all praise to his understanding of the human body through jiu-jitsu. It had canonized Royce and the Gracie name, but it also soothed spectators that this new world would still have a place for traditionalism that had been able to be perceived beyond the veil of myth and legend. Two organizations on opposite sides of the world, both revolutionary in their design, but they could not be further apart in philosophy. Where the UFC held a single event in 1993, Pancrase holds 4, pumping out a similar cast of fighters each month. It's a testament to the scaled-back brutality as well as the pro-wrestling-driven philosophy that allows this to happen. Wrestlers are on the road constantly, wrestle multiple days in a week, and even though it isn't violent concussive blows to the head or strangling submissions with the intent to harm, that physicality still takes its toll. But there they are the next night, ready to do it again for a new crowd. There are all sorts of problems with both approaches. Once again, I promise we'll get there. But as 1993 ends, there are two forces in the world that are presenting something that had never been seen before. Real, open-style combat, no gloves, and very few limitations. If 1993 was the genesis, then 1994 was when the chaos began to form into the shapes that we recognize today. Into the mountains, into the trees, into the signs of life that would grow into men.